Hi guys, welcome back. My name is Jaspreet and today we will be glazing some bowls. I got a request for some glazing videos, so here we are. We'll be glazing the bowls we made a few weeks back in one of the tutorials. All the tools and materials and glazes that I used today will be listed in the description below. If you have any ideas or suggestions for future videos, do let me know in the comments below. Alright, let's get started with glazing. So here are two bisque bowls and they're now ready for the glaze. Now before I start glazing, the first thing I'm going to do is just take a sponge, dip it in water, squeeze it out, basically a damp sponge, and using that I'll just clean the bisque surface. This is just to make sure there's no dust on the surface so that the glaze can adhere to the surface without skipping. So I'm just cleaning off the pot. Some people like to dunk their pots in water and let them dry out before glazing. I find this easier to do. So I just take a damp sponge and clean off this surface. Now also while I'm doing this, what I'm going to do is just check the surface to make sure there are no clay crumbs, sharp edges, any kind of uneven surface. Just going through the pot, making sure everything is nice and smooth. If there are any sharp edges or clay crumbs that I see, I'll take a sanding pad, dip it in water and just go over it to smoothen it out. And now these are ready to glaze. Now for glazing, I have a plan. So we'll do two different combinations here. I will be using some Spectrum glazes. So this is soft aqua from Spectrum. I'll be using this on the outside for this texture and white on the inside. Now this is a glaze that I make in my studio. It is actually a dip and pour glaze, but then its texture is quite nice, so I'm able to brush it on without much issue. So that's going to be on the inside. So this will be soft aqua from Spectrum and my studio white. You can use any mid-fire glazes. Now these are going to be fired to about 1200 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to use glazes which melt to those temperatures, right? So that's one, Spectrum and my studio glaze. And for this one, I'm thinking soft white. That's another glaze from Spectrum on the outside. And on the inside, I'm thinking a mixture of Snapdragon, which is an Amaco glaze. It is a red color Amaco glaze, a celadon glaze. But I add my studio white to it. And I'm thinking I'll add that to the inside of this pot. Because by itself, that red is quite a lot. And I want a soft pink. I can use weeping plum as well, but I have this already mixed up, so I'm going to use Amaco and my studio white. So that's the plan, and let's get started. So I'm going to start with this one. I'll first do the inside and then go on to the outside. Just shake the bottle to mix the glaze. And then for glazing, I like to use these number 8 Mayco brushes, fan brushes. They are nice and fluffy and they hold a lot of color. They hold a lot of glaze, and that's, I think, one of the things with glazing is that you need a brush which can hold a lot of color, so you can cover a decent area without having to go in over and over again, though you will have to do it. But let me just show you how to do this. So I'm going to just mix the glaze well in the bottle, in the jar itself first, load up my brush, right, and then start glazing. I'll start at the base. Now I keep going in with my brush till the glaze dries out. As soon as the glaze starts drying out on the bisque surface, I just pull out my brush, dip it again in the glaze, and then load it up and go in again. And while the surface is wet, I kind of keep brushing. As soon as it starts drying out, I lift my brush. I don't dry brush because dry brush is what is going to usually give you those streak marks. Now when you do something like this, but I continue brushing when it's still wet on the surface, because I don't want my glaze to pool in one particular area. I like to spread it out. So if it's thicker in one area, it will be darker there. If it's lighter, if it's not as thick, it's going to be lighter. So there will be a little bit of a difference. So that's my one coat done. Now I'm going to wait for it to dry out completely. Wait for your glaze to dry completely before you go in with your second coat. Again, I'm just mixing my glaze well, then going in with the second coat. Now when you do your second coat, you'll see that the glaze, like one brush load of glaze will cover a larger area. Given that you already have one coat in there, it's just a little easier to brush on the second coat. Now for the this rim on the top, this little pearl thing that we did, I'm going to just take this brush and add it right here on the edge. So that's one coat on the edge. I'm going to wait for it to dry out a little bit and then go in and do the second coat. And make sure it gets into all of these recessed areas here on the top, in between the pearls. So that's my second coat done. So that's the inside of the bowl, almost done. Now I'm going to wait for it to dry out before I start glazing the outside. Now let's bring in this guy, the second bowl. For this, I'm going to be using my Studio White. Now this is a recipe that I found on glazing.org, and I've made it with the ingredients that are available here, easily accessible. So again, I'm mixing it nicely in the jar, and again using the Mayco No. 8 fan brush. Okay, holding my pot in my hand so it's easy to kind of move, loading up my brush, and then starting at the center. Now, like I said, this is a dip and pour glaze, so it's not as easy to brush on as probably a brush on glaze, because it doesn't have all those extra materials that make it easy to brush it on. It's just pure glaze materials, and that's why they tend to dry out pretty quickly, since they don't have the additives which make it easy to brush it on. So I'm just going to wait for it to dry out a little bit. I think it's more or less dry. I'm going to go in with my second coat. Again, loading my brush until the surface is wet. I keep going up and down, keep brushing. As soon as my brush dries out or the surface dries out, I pull out my brush and load it again. I think that's done. Now I'm going to just do the rim quickly, just a tiny bit onto the rim here. Now glazing will take some practice. Your initial few pots may not be as you expect them to be, and all the glazes will behave differently. So the different line of glazes that you use, they will all have slightly different properties, and the number of coats you need, how thick they need to be, all of those things you'll understand as you spend more time glazing and playing with your glazes. So that's a learning curve there with glazing, and that's a process which I don't necessarily enjoy too much, but that is a final step. Unless you do this, you don't get the beautiful pots at the end. So this is an important step. Alright, so I'm going to let this dry and we come back to this one, and I'm going to now bring in my soft white, and again mix it in the jar first. Now soft white is a really melty glaze. It's like that one of those really melty fluxy glazes. So what I do is, and it comes really thick, so I will usually add, let me just use this. So I will usually add some water to it to thin it down, so that it's not as thick and slightly easier to apply. And the other thing is that because it melts a lot. I mean, that's a property of this glaze, that it melts a lot. Now glazes like Celadon glazes, like Amaco Celadon, other Celadon glazes which are translucent glazes, those glazes tend to be relatively stable. They don't melt and flux too much. I mean, they'll melt and fuse on your surface, but they don't usually melt so much that they'll drip off the pot in general. But this glaze and all the soft white, the soft aqua, all of these glazes, they are really thick and they tend to melt and flux quite a bit. So what I do is, in order to make it a little bit more stable, not really stable, but just to avoid them melting so much that they literally go off the pot, I just thin them down a little bit. That makes glazing the pot easier, and then since the glaze is not as thick, it doesn't melt too much. Now even for this, when I glaze this, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to do one coat on the entire pot, and the second coat I'm only going to do up until here, just halfway through this pot, because this glaze is going to melt, and I'm going to make sure that my foot ring is absolutely clean, there's no glaze here, and I also wipe the surface off here. So these are things I'm going to take care of, because I know this glaze can really melt. So that is the plan. Again, I'm mixing my glaze really well and using the same number 8 fan brush. Now if you see, this glaze is quite thin. If you see, that's how much I've thinned it down. When it comes in a jar, it will be much thicker. Alright, so now let's get started. I'm going to just hold my pot in a way that I can easily brush it on. load up your brush, go onto the pot surface and spread out your glaze. While the surface is still wet, you can continue brushing. As soon as it dries out, just pull out your brush and load it up again. This is just to get a nice even coat. Now because this glaze has dried out, I'm able to hold it from the inside and just go along the edge, along the pot surface and glaze this. Okay, so that's my one coat done. This is almost dried out, so I'm going to go in now and focus on this area only, just the top half of the pot. And this is something that you learn as you play with these glazes, because obviously on the jar it says 2 to 3 coats. 2 to 3 coats are going to melt like crazy and they're going to mess up my pot. So I know not to use 2 to 3 coats. I literally use just 1.5 coat and that does it for me. Now I'm just spreading the glaze wherever I can see it's still a little damp. I'm just spreading it out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just checking the bottom to see if there are any areas that were missed, because we do try to brush it on quickly so you get an even coat. So you will sometimes miss out a few areas. For that, what I'll do is I'll pick up a smaller brush. Now this is one of my bamboo brushes that I use. Again, just dip this in water and, for example, going around the foot here. I don't want too much glaze here, but I also don't want any bare clay surface just because it looks unfinished. So I'm just going to make sure that I fill up all of these tiny areas. And then if the glaze has skipped any spots, I'm going to go in and dab a little bit there. Now for this, it's better to use a smaller brush, because obviously with a fan brush, you're going to have a lot more glaze, which is going to spread on the surface. I'm just taking this brush and making sure all the bits are filled up. Though the way this glaze melts, it's going to mostly cover up everything, but then on your end, it's better to just be a little more careful. Now I'm going to take a damp sponge and clean off the foot ring here. Get a nice even line right to the edge. You just make sure that this is all clean. Now for a couple of reasons. One, again, the finish of the pot looks more finished when you have a clean line there. And the second thing is that you don't want any glaze on the foot ring, on the base of the foot, because if there's any glaze, it is going to fuse with the kiln shelf and destroy your pot as well as your kiln shelf. So that is done. Now that's our pot done, all glazed. Let's come to the second one. All right, let's bring in soft aqua. Again, I have thinned down this as well. Like I said, soft aqua, soft white, pearl white, all of these glazes, they are those extensively melty glazes. All right, now for this one, again, I'm going to hold it from the foot this time, mix up my glaze well using the Mayco No. 8 fan brush. Again, if you see, my glaze is really thin, and I'm going to do the same thing, probably one full coat and halfway down for the second coat. And if some of your glaze is not getting into all these finer textured areas, you can always use a dabbing motion. So I'll load up my brush, just go onto the clay surface like this. If there are, places the glaze is skipping, you just do a little bit of dab, dab, dab. Again, cover up. So that's my one coat done. Okay, I'm going to wait for this to dry out. It's almost dry at the side we started. All right, I think that's done. Now what I'm going to do is just clean up my hands. I'm going to clean up again, I will bring my small brush and just go around the foot ring to make sure it's all nicely covered and there are no bare spots on the clay surface. Oh my God, okay. Just around the foot ring, one very thin coat. Once I've done that, I'm going to wait for it to dry out a little bit and then I'm going to start cleaning the foot. Making sure there's a nice clean line there. Now while doing this, we did bump a little bit of it right here. So I'm going to add a little bit of the glaze to cover this up and also the white glaze. That's my white glaze. I'm going to just add it with the finger because I bumped a little bit off. Now here's what I'm thinking. I'm just tempted to add a little bit of white here, maybe soft white because we have it right here. just at the edge, because like I said, it melts a little bit. I think it will be a nice look to have a little bit of, melting happening here. Not too much, just a little bit. And for that, again, I'm going to be using this smaller brush. Bring in my soft white, mix it well, and just go onto the rim. For this, I'll probably bring in my binding wheel, place it here. It will just become a little easier. And then just go around on the rim. Now, if you see, I'm not doing a very thick coat. It's just a thin coat. Probably do 2, because this is quite thinned out, so you might not see much difference at the end. But since I want a little bit of melting on the rim, I am adding my second coat onto this. Okay, I think we are good. Yeah, so that looks good. Now we just make sure again there's no glaze at the back, and then we will fire this to about 1200 degrees Celsius, and I'll show you what the final pieces look like once it's been glazed. So here are my bowls after glazing, and I love the way they've turned out. These were fired to cone 5-6, about 1200 degrees Celsius, and this is what it looks like. This is my soft white, and if you remember, we just did 1.5 kind of coat, and you can see it still covered a lot of the base here. And it's a beautiful glaze which melts really well and does show the texture. But when it gets too thick, it can cover some of the texture as well. So that's a risk with this glaze, but once you thin it down, you can make it work. And that's why I like this glaze. It has a lot of variation. It has a little bit of this color variation that you see. And you can see how beautiful this looks on texture. And this is the inside. There's a little bit of the detail around the rim. I think that looks beautiful. I love the way this turned out. Here's the other one. Now this pot did warp a little bit. You can see this is slightly off, but the glaze itself is beautiful. Again, we did add a little bit of soft white on the rim, which I think is what these melts are. Again, here also we've done 1 full coat and half a coat, and just about, maybe 2/3 of the way in. And you can see again this glaze breaks really beautifully over the texture. But again, the thing with this glaze is it's a thick glaze. If you thin it down, it does a better job at showing the texture. And then we have these added runs from the soft white that we added on the rim. And that's the white inside. I think there's no issue here. Yes, this is slightly warped, but glaze wise, there's no issue. So these are the bowls that we made today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.